All right, everybody, welcome. I have my special guest here. This is Professor Rachel Fulton Brown. Uh, she studies history, among other things, and we're going to talk about the intimacy crisis and give a little historical perspective on that. And we'll probably touch on a bunch of other things just to round things out, because I think a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about, we'll say, um, how what we're going through today is not entirely dissimilar from other incidents in the past, and maybe that'll help guide us through these crises, whether you want to categorize them as meaning crises, which I think is the result of the intimacy crisis, roughly speaking, or you want to call it the meta crisis, or crisis of the week, however you want to do that. And hopefully I now have the historical firepower to help me disentangle some of this. So feel free to introduce yourself.
Okay, I'll do my best. Yeah, so I teach at the University of Chicago, and my specialty is European history with focus on medieval Christianity. But I've taught there for 30 years in a number of different capacities. So let's do it. I have a question for you first. What do you mean by the intimacy crisis? What is that? That is it's clearly something you've been talking about before. So what is it that you're most curious about?
Yeah, so for me, John Vervaeke came up with this wonderful YouTube series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which is not correctly named. It should be Awakening to the Meaning Crisis. Doesn't contain the from part. And we were researching this for quite a while because, from my perspective, that's the science of meaning that sort of helps you understand the pragmatic approach that Jordan Peterson has to the same problem. I mean, they're colleagues, right? Or they were colleagues at the University of Toronto. We're talking about the same thing, using slightly different language in some cases. John likes to invoke a lot of Greek words and co-opt a few Latin words in the process. Sometimes to great effect.
People who are doing that are usually just labeling. It's just the same thing in English, but in a different language. It's a fancy trick.
Right.
Beware of them. Beware of them.
Right. Well, and I think I'll bring that up too. So when I looked at the meaning crisis, and one of the unique features of the meaning crisis is, wow, it seems to be a lot of men. It's very mysterious.
A lot of men. Okay.
Yeah. Why are there all these men? And it occurred to me that one way to think about this whole milieu of problems, if you will, is men go through a meaning crisis, women have an intimacy crisis. Now, I think the intimacy crisis precedes the meaning crisis, because the way I describe the intimacy crisis is the following. You don't have the ability, for whatever reason, we can get into that, to make and understand and maybe even see quality relationships. So maybe you see relationships, but they're all physical, right? But you don't see the different qualities of relationships. And so you would come up with what I would call strange questions, like, what's the difference between, a friendship and your best friendship? Or why can't your spouse be your best friend? Or, all these silly, in my opinion, silly ways of thinking about the world that's very kind of flat. Like, oh, well, I have the same relationship with my spouse that I have with my friend. Like, that doesn't, or my sister or my brother or my cousin or, some guy I met on the internet. Like, these are all relationships with different qualities. And for Vervaeke, for example, is kind of there, right? He talks about qualia, which is, and to your point, like, these are just fancy words that we have better words.
I mean, sometimes, and I'm revising that in my head. It's like sometimes it does help to use them as a technical label for things, but it's challenging because sometimes people are using them as a mystifier as opposed to a clarifier. It's just
right.
I know a lot of Latin, but I also know when doctors are using it to disguise the fact that they don't know what you're sick with. So it can go both ways.
Yeah, well, and the language is a problem, and so, for example, one sort of example of what I call the flattening of the world is people will go, "Oh, that's all jargon," and it's like, no, no,
Mm,
jargon's a thing, but that's actually not jargon. There's something
right.
else going on, and people can't differentiate those things because they don't understand quality. And so, one of the examples I gave in one of the talks I did, I think it was my first talk on the intimacy crisis. Um, some I did with this. YouTube channel called Andrea with the Bangs, who's a very sweet person. And she said, "Oh, do you think this has something to do with why people think that Sam and Frodo and Lord of the Rings must be gay?" And I'm like, "Yes, exactly, right." Because if you don't understand that sort of a relationship that a man can have for another man that isn't physical, right? But it's
Mhm.
a deep mutual respect and understanding and a level of submission based on a recognition. Well, this guy is clearly better than I am at something, or clearly has a level of understanding that I don't have, and I'm not going to sleep with him, but I
Well, I mean,
understand what you're called.
With Frodo and Sam, it's master and servant. It's quite clear. It's uh, Frodo is the officer, and Sam is the Batman who, in World War One terms, the servant who takes care of
Mm,
him. And I mean, that's why he calls him Master Frodo the whole time. And then
right.
when he himself has to take on that role of decision making, he in the chapter title he's Master Samwise, so he has to then assume that responsibility because Frodo was knocked out by Shelob's sting, and then but when he comes back he is servant. So it's not only just intimacy, that we don't understand the social relationships of leadership and service in
Right.
that particular example. The other if we
Right.
want to talk hobbits, I can do that, endlessly, because I mean all four of them have a very interesting problem. Of Pippin's the youngest, Merry's the most responsible, Frodo is obviously the one that carries the great burden, and Sam is the servant to Frodo. That it's like they're not just four guys, right? There's a lot of very subtle and important relationships that Tolkien's showing through those characters.
Right. Well, and I think part of the reason why people even will say very smart people, well, I have my questions about their smartness, but people you would consider very smart don't understand like what you just outlined, which is no, there's all these inherent relationships. I think this is what I'm calling the flattening of the world. When you flatten the world,
Mm,
you destroy quality, because quality is
right.
on this line that, just for the sake of people who actually don't know better, obviously you way understand this better, is on what like Vervaeke and Peterson and those guys are calling the line of vertical causality, which is strangely correct and yet so missing the point at the same time, right? And so that's what causes the intimacy crisis, is you basically can't see up or down for that matter. And so
Mm.
the side effect is you don't
Oh, so
recognize
yeah,
you.
the sort of flattening of the equality language, that we're all
Yes,
supposed to be equal. Okay,
right.
so I'm hearing a variety of ways. I say before we came on, you were asking me how you should introduce me, and I'm like, well, which me do you want? And I think I get it. I'll offer you a few. Right. One
Sure.
is I'm nearly 60, so that makes me I'll be 60 in February, right? I that gives me a particular viewpoint as someone who's lived through some of the stories that you're trying to understand. It's like what happened to us in the 70s after, you know, abortion became readily available. How did those of us who grew up, Gen Xers, right? We
Mm,
we have a role right now. We got to speak up, because a lot of the
right.
things that I think the present younger generations are dealing with are things that we were subjected to, fell silent about, and now really need to talk about, right? So that's one layer.
Mm,
Another is, of course, as historian, and as someone who's thought about the long development of Christianity, and certain kinds of language about love and sexuality that come out of that tradition. And then there's Tolkien, which I can also talk in depth about, because I teach a course on Tolkien um, for many years at the university, and I've also done a series of videos about some of that, right? So if people want more on that part of my background, we can point them to that. But it's like, where would you most want to to go with what you're describing, because I think that for the women, for women's intimacy crisis, one, I am one, so there you go. And my credit, I'll say my my, my credential is I'm nearly 60, and I think also that because of different conversations I've been in over the most recent years on the internet, my praising men and chivalry and so forth. The opposite side is like what women's romantic thinking is like, and like
Mm.
why do, I mean, if we have an intimacy crisis, I think actually women are talking about it all the time, but it's not in the place where people tend to want to acknowledge, which is in romance novels, obviously, and
Right.
the sort of imagery that
Yep.
comes out of that. So I'm happy to go in any of those different directions.
Okay. Let me lay out I think just three things. And you can touch on them or not. I'll just try to give you a sense for the framing and where I'm coming from. But
Mm.
yeah, and this is so perfect. Having you here is so perfect. I appreciate it. So
I'm gonna land on the fact that I'm nearly 60 about 18 times, right? It's like,
that's fine. That's fine. Well,
guys,
it's good.
guys, we
Yeah.
lived through this, right? It's now time to listen to those of us who are old enough to be your grandparents and aren't necessarily yet, for lots of complicated reasons having to do with what happened as we were growing up, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think there's all sorts of ways in which just the knowledge of previous generations has also been disrupted and shattered.
Yeah, completely. And
Yeah.
I mean, you see it in storytelling, right? The
Oh
heroes are
yeah.
always children now. It's like, what? No, please stop. Yeah, yeah, the whole idea of hero. But so there's three sort of things that I'm sort of curious about. So I don't know if you're familiar with Jonathan Peugeot.
Mhm.
Um, so he talks about, you know, we've lost the way that medievals thought about the world. And I'm like, oh, that's definitely wrapped up in this. And my suspicion is, and again, I mean, we can get into this or not. I just want to lay it on the table. And if we touch on it, we
I
do.
will
And if
challenge Jonathan's background in medieval for real.
I know, yeah, but well, I do too, because he hasn't said what he means by that, right? So
No,
he's like,
I think it's I again, I've talked to him a few times on his show, but that was a long time ago. And my sense is he uses medieval as a frame for mist, right? There's a lost
yeah,
time that we wish we had access to, which is
right,
appropriate, right? Because that's one of the things that medieval is. It's that whole tradition that the Enlightenment and the 19th century, well, the Enlightenment actively destroyed.
right,
The 19th century, which is I think where Jonathan is usually operating in his medievalisms, enchanted and then replayed, right?
yeah,
Particularly in things like fairy tales, and then in the 20th century forgot. Right. So medieval can mean a lot of different things as well. Yeah.
right,
Okay. So
right. But I
I'm
think
staking out my expertise now.
that's good. That's good. Yeah, and I think what was lost, if you will, is not, we'll say, knowledge as conveyed by books or schools or dare I say, even we'll say, traditional learning. I think it's knowledge by way of the frames that were assumed that you sort of automatically, you were born into a caste. You're just like, of course I was. You never question that sort of thing because there's no reason to, and not never, but like it was assumed. And now we're living in this sort of equality thing, and the equality is sort of brought about by what I call the age of gnosis, which is where you think knowledge as propositions or language as such is the highest value. And then everybody can be equal because of course you can just send somebody to school and they get knowledge. Everybody knows that. Uh, right, and then bang, we're all, that's a lot of where the equality comes from. Of course, that creates its
I
own set
accept.
of problems.
Yes, I accept that description. Your description of the medieval I don't accept, but I think you're right about the way in which we use the claim of equalizing through the particular kind of education we get, but it's a flattening. I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah, it's a flattening to propositions. John Vervaeke actually coined the term propositional tyranny, and I was like,
Mm,
oh, that's mysteriously correct, and yet
yes.
it misses something important. And so from that we got the age of gnosis. which is this age where it's knowledge, but it's only propositional knowledge. And then what's happening is, as the propositional knowledge, the propositional tyranny breaks down because it can't explain a bunch of things like every important thing in the world, like love. Right. I
Right.
mean, this is
Yes.
this
No,
is this
there,
is
yeah, I
right.
agree with that. That's a good description. I like that.
Right. So then what they're doing is they're adding to knowledge, which actually on I kind of agree with John on some of that, right? He talks about propositional knowledge versus participatory knowledge. And I'm like, actually, that's really good framing, even though he's wrong. Yes, participation is super important, but and now we're rediscovering Girard and mimicry, and I'm like, really, this is not something you got by being in the world and like
Oh, Girard, I love
learning.
your my team of poets and I use a lot of Girard, so we can talk about that definitely.
Yeah, I'm not
Yeah.
not a super huge fan of Gerard, but I mean, he's got some
Well,
good
we
points.
can
But
we can we can talk about that. Thus
yeah.
far you haven't named anybody I'm a super huge fan of. So I
Oh,
mean,
okay.
except Gerard, right? But
Okay.
I think, but I mean, based on what you're describing, I'd say this is my frustration as an actual historian of medieval, like, prayer, liturgy, devotion, art. I mean, medieval studies, but none of those things actually fit in the category that people tend to think of now as like what we're able to talk about as historians, because they have an interior that is hard for us to access. Most of what you're describing as you're feeling like there's something lost gets nowhere near the richness of what's actually been lost. It's I mean,
Right.
it's horrifying and tragic. But
Right.
there's hope, because ironically, we are in a situation where more of these texts are available in English than have ever been in the history of any time,
Mm,
right? It's like the last 30 years have been a magnificent renaissance, if you will, of translation of medieval texts. And it's strange that therefore we don't have in the modern public discussion an actual understanding of what's in those texts, because they're all available in languages that people can, modern people tend to read now, not just Latin. Um, the place where I think I'll try to put in something more rigorous, where you're describing how you knew who you were in the Middle Ages. You participated in the liturgy, and the
mhm.
sort of givenness of, I mean, things like social hierarchy. We're born into social hierarchies now. I mean, that's a kind of, it's a massive fiction that the United States depends on for our education system, to the pretense that we have no social
Right.
hierarchies. We definitely do.
Of
And
course we
we
do.
have regional hierarchies. We have, I mean, certainly the promise of the educational hierarchy, which is why, we've promoted it in the way that we have since World War II, is, you can go into that system and come out middle class, right?
Right.
That only works if you have this concept of a thing called middle class. You're not going to go into that education system and come out a lord, an aristocrat, because we don't have them.
Exactly.
But I mean, I'm guessing you're Canadian. I don't know
No,
this. You're not.
no,
Okay. You
no.
you have some northern. Where are you from?
I grew up in New England.
Ah, yes, okay. Yes, you don't have my speech patterns, right? Because so
Nope.
there's that kind of, I mean, New England has a definite, like, hierarchical status against the rest of the country that none of us will ever
Yep.
catch up to, because no Rice or University of Chicago, one place I went to as an undergraduate, one place I teach, will ever be the Harvard of anything, but not Harvard, right? It's like
That's
we
right.
we we have a lot of that feeling of hierarchy in our own system. But the promise of the go into the middle class, you will therefore not be working class, right? And if you
Right.
think about what's just happened in our most recent election, it's a battle between those two classes, right? It's a battle between the
Yep.
college educated and the working class. So it's a um we know we've told ourselves stories about who we are as Americans for a long time that don't fit anything that we really are. And a lot of what we think we know about the Middle Ages, I mean, if you're from New England, you'll have read Mark Twain. Yes.
Yep.
Connecticut Yankee, right?
Yep.
How much of your imagination of the Middle Ages depends on that book?
Yeah. No, it's a
Yeah.
good point.
I mean,
Right.
the evil, enslaving Catholic Church. It's like a lot of modern thinking about what the Middle Ages was is anti-Catholic, right?
Right.
Straight up, right? So it's like I feel I thinking of fairy tales wise. It's like the Middle Ages has been asleep for all this time, and the thorns have grown up, and we need to like cut our way through all of those thorns to find the actual princess, because we don't we a good deal of modernity's self-conception depends on that vilification of the Middle Ages, because we are not that, right? Just as
Right.
a good deal of the middle class self-perception depends on vilifying the working class, saying we're not that.
Right. Right. Well, there's a lot of what my good friend Manuel Post calls identification against, where
Yes.
you're not
Yes. Right.
identifying what you are, you're not standing on anything or standing for anything or standing anywhere,
Right.
or at least, that's what you're projecting, that you're not standing anywhere, right? Which is of course impossible, so it comes out anyway. While at the same time, um, you're relying on your identification as not this well identified thing, this thing that I
Yes.
understand.
Yes, you're the negative image of that demon.
Right. And that's
Which,
very binary. That's what I call binary thinking.
well, and from my perspective as, both a Christian and a medievalist, it's incredibly frustrating, because it means even to the extent now in, modern political usage, we're saying there's such a thing as Christian nationalism. I'm like, not really. Or, that
Yeah.
there's, Christ is king. Well, yes, but not the way you're hoping.
Yeah. Yeah.
That there's a impoverishment, a desperate impoverishment of our idea of you know the actual mystery that we are baptized into. And
Right.
I would one, of the many great lies that were promulgated about the Middle Ages. They started with Luther in 1520 or thereabouts, claiming that the clergy had never taught the laity anything. And that's just a
Mm.
flat out misrepresentation of indeed his own audience, right? That Luther in the Reformation would not have had all of those readers hungry for the knowledge of what was in the scriptures if in fact there hadn't been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of education. So,
Exactly.
the primary claim that the Protestants make, which is what Mark Twain is playing with in Connecticut Yankee, right? It's like, oh, the clergy kept the peasantry in ignorance because that's the only way they could, exert their mystifying power over them. I'm like, are you kidding? Have you ever read medieval history about how it's nothing but the preachers trying to figure out how better to preach? Right.
Right. Right.
That we have whole orders of Franciscans and Dominicans who are designed, their entire education is designed around how do you teach Christianity better, right?
Right.
So
Right.
the Protestant Reformation is the first giant lie, which has some layers of effect because of my great hero is Marshall McLuhan. So I hope you like him, because we're going to hear about him now. That having a media transformation does change the way in which people think about what it means to know things. And
Right.
with the printing press and with the books that come in, which are invented in the Middle Ages because everybody wants to read more, right? It's like, oh, the Middle Ages didn't have the printing press, right? The Middle Ages invented the printing press because they wanted more books, and the first things they start printing are prayer books, not just
Right.
Bibles, but prayer books, and they learn to say the Psalms. So fast forward 100 years, and you get the population of Europe, hungry for knowledge about Christ and the prayer and how better to be Christian. The Reformation makes no sense if nobody cared, right? It's like
Right. Right.
you don't get everybody that excited about the need for knowledge of the Gospels if they weren't already in a position to care that they have that, like we are now, right? It's like you and I are having this conversation online because people are actually hungry for knowledge. I mean, we may not have as big an audience as some people online, right? But
Yeah.
there's enough people out there now, and I mean, you're saying the men have a knowledge. You started that with women have an
Meaning.
intimacy crisis, men
Yep.
have a meaning
Meaning
crisis.
crisis. Yep.
The one truest thing that Jordan Peterson said back in the day when he was first getting all the attention was, YouTube was largely male.
Yep.
I see there are two things that I see on YouTube that are delightfully male. One is getting to have conversations like this, right? Because I get lots more invitations from men to be on their podcasts like this than women. And I think that's because there's more of you asking these questions, wanting to have
Yep.
the conversation, really wanting to delve into it. The other thing is on YouTube that my husband watches is how to. videos, right?
Yep.
It's like I go in, it's like, what are you watching now? It's like, oh, how to, sharpen the axe, how to fix the sight on the rifle, how
Right.
to, do carpentry. It's like there's enormous hunger for knowledge and meaning, and the men are making it out there on YouTube, so go guys. Right? it's
Yeah. Yeah.
it's really good. Right? I think women, we don't have the internet is a perilous place for us because we have different needs, but the transformation in the media that we're going through, I think, you could say you're hungry for meaning. The books are still all out there, but it does feel like you're hungry for a kind of conversation that can help you build up knowledge. So I'm,
Yeah.
that's great. But anyway,
Right.
to say we're constantly defining ourselves by what we aren't. The modernity defined itself by its claims about what the previous period had not been, but
Right.
most of those claims are flat out lies, that they
Lies.
wouldn't
Yep.
have had those anxieties if they weren't already available to them from the tradition itself.
Right. Right. Yeah. Boy, there's a lot there, and I want to touch on a bunch of it. So
Let's see, preaching in the Middle Ages, the Reformation now, right? Go
I
for it. Which part?
one of the other things I wanted to drop in, other than what we just went over, is this idea that part of the problem is that, and you will see this if you see Peterson or Vervaeke or Dawkins or any of these guys talk to anybody religious or deeply religious, especially somebody sort of playing the same game like Bishop Barron. Man, there was a conversation called the Four Horsemen of Meaning, which was Peterson, Vervaeke, Peugeot, and Bishop Barron,
Okay.
if memory serves. And it was a mess.
I want a horse. I want a horse. Where's my horse?
We could be the
we get the donkeys.
We could be the two apocalypse of
the two donkeys.
intimacy.
Yeah.
The two donkeys of intimacy. That's perfect.
Christ rode a donkey. Come on, we get a donkey. Okay,
there we go. But you see this back and forth where they're using the same words, but they're not the same words at all.
Right? Yes.
Right.
Right.
There's a gap in conception, and so the problem for people talk about Christian apologists, and I'm like, just do away with those people. Like, line them against the wall. This is pointless. This is pointless because they're trying to. First of all, they're trying to play a game they're not good at. That's like, I never do that. I'm like, I'm not good at this game. I don't like to lose. I'm out. Like, I'm not even gonna go down that road.
Well, I don't do that either, and I would say I'm not good at it, but I think because I hope I understand the peril. I'm going to say guys who have those the ortho bros and the trad cats and all of those. I see them as a part of the phenomenon of the internet that we're in, and so I can celebrate that. But I do agree they tend to get trapped. I was my own podcast. I did a singleton because I was supposed to have a guest and he got tied up. At least he better have, because he didn't show up anyway. So I was talking about one of the debates that showed up on the Timcast recently about religion, and realizing nobody was, they can't define the term.
That's
and so
right.
when they're talking about, the Constitution, our Constitution is made, they're quoting Adam's letter. Constitution is made for moral and religious people. They have no idea. No conversation can happen because they're each assuming a different definition, and they don't know the history of the problem, so they don't know the reason why they're not going to convince each other, because one of them's thinking of religion, in the sort of 1893 World Parliament of Religions terms, and another is thinking of religion in the terms of Protestant providential historiography, and they're not going to meet.
They're never going They're never going to meet. And so when the apologists go up against, what happens is each side sees a win for them. And some of them are quite good. Like, I don't know if you checked out Andrew Wilson and the Crucible crew. Andrew Wilson's excellent. Like, he can actually go toe to toe with any of these logic, reason, and rationality people, and he's going to beat most of them because he's really, really good. Right? Ben Shapiro's another one. Actually, Ben's really, really good at that sort of thing. He doesn't play quite in that space, but he's really good with logic, reason, and rationality. So if he goes up against a PhD, he's actually probably going to do pretty well, if not win. The problem is that there's no prize because you can't explain to them conceptually what's been lost. So what happens is you have what I call Christianese being spoken on one side, and then you have
Mhm.
all quote secular language, even though there's no such thing as secularity. There's all this scientific age of
Oh, well,
gnosis.
there is. The secular is a Christian concept. It
Well,
just means of this
oh,
age.
of this,
They
right?
would not even be thinking in secular terms if they weren't thinking accidentally as they are because they don't know the history of the concept in Augustinian terms that there
Right,
is the city
right.
of God and the city of the world. Secular simply means the city of the world.
City of
So
the world,
the
right?
entire
Yeah,
the
yeah.
entire I mean this is what's so ironic about all of it. The entire claim of the secular is a Christian concept. And this
Mhm.
is so for example, one of the things that came up in the Timcast incidentally, I don't think they pursued it. It's like, Islam, right? Oh, well, Islam doesn't take the state, religion out of its law. And it's like, well, yes, because they have no concept of the secular.
That's right.
because they don't have the same sort of understanding of relationship between heaven and earth that we do as Christians. So you're not going to have a separation out. The law is the law and it's given by God. That's it.
Right,
And this
right.
this has been I remember back in the days when the United States was in Iraq, uh, there was a good essay in now I'm forgetting. I think it's Lewis Lapham's essay. I hope it was. Um, but it was talking about how our terms as Americans, things we need to have the secular world and the separation of church and state, applied to Islamic countries make no sense, right? And
Yeah,
we're never
right,
going to persuade them
right.
that we should have an enlightened secular world because they don't see they don't
I
see
don't know
a,
what that
a
is.
they don't know what that is, right?
Yeah,
I
and
I
no
think
concept.
Judaism has a a different history and so have different concept thing. I mean, it's like once you're taught, this is why what's so frustrating for me, obviously as both a historian and a Christian, is most of the time these debates are taking place within a Christian assumption of reality, but with
Yes,
this, oh yes, but we can think about the laws of nature and not need to be Christian. It's like, no, you can't. You literally can't, because there's no frame in which you have a
that's
creator
right.
who creates according to you know the measure, weight, and number that we can, given the rationality of our souls, understand by contemplation. That is an entirely Christian
Right,
formulation of the situation. So yes, that's why we have Western science, right?
right.
I mean, I'm surprised, given how prominent many of the people that you are talking about are, that nobody said that to them. Maybe Sometimes
Me
I've
too.
tried sometimes I've tried, but they tend not to pay attention to me long enough. No, seriously,
There's a
Jonathan at one point was trying to get Jordan Peterson to talk to me. This was like ages and ages and ages ago, and
I mean,
it never
yeah.
happened. I'm
No.
sorry. I'm sorry that this didn't happen. Because they're just fundamental historical problems in the claims that they're making. And these guys are all, they're trained as scientists, and science itself in modernity, one, it got like amnesia over why it has the terms that it does. And as you say, since the 17th century they've been asking the mechanistic questions. They've got in Aristotelian terms, you have the material and the efficient cause. They worry about the material cause a lot, right? They worry about the physical stuff out of which things are happening. They do worry to a certain extent about the efficient cause, but maybe not. Formal and final, never, right?
Never.
So we
Right,
never
right,
can have a question about like what are things made to be, right? The form or
right,
purpose. So
right,
yes, and when you say that the men that you're talking to are in this crisis of meaning, it's because philosophically there's no, I mean, it's no metaphysics, right? But philosophically, they aren't even dealing with the full concept of causation,
right, right. And they can't.
and they
And this
can't.
is this is so um it's interesting, right? Because when you look at it, you know, historically, you see this attempted separation from the church by education, science, however you want to, right? There's this untethering because we destroyed the monasteries, right? That
Just
causes all,
anti-Catholicism. Just say it. It's just
but
it's,
ultimately it
no,
is, right?
it's straight up. It is, yes,
And it's
because
this
it's
constant,
anti-scholastic, and therefore
right?
it's no, it doesn't have the Aristotelian structuring. Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah.
And where they're coming now is they're going to Plato, skipping over Aristotle, because that'll cause all kinds of problems. And they'll say Aristotle to be nice, but they skip right over final cause. That's why around here we say make final cause great again quite often.
Oh, yes.
So, yeah, yeah.
Well,
That's
so
that's
actually, I mean, we're hopping around a lot. I hope your audience is okay with that. To bring back both Plato and Aristotle is a challenge, and I actually just gave a talk at a conference my brother organized. If you guys look at my Substack, it's the Two Cultures talking numbers, numbering words, no numbering, oh, whatever. Anyway, and the thing is, the Western tradition is both Plato and Aristotle. It's like
right,
without one or the other, we tend to go nuts, right?
right,
For too Platonic, we end up with totalitarian mysticism.
right.
Right. Either the destruction of you can't have an equal sort of government or anything in the Republic in the way Plato imagines it, because you have nothing but those philosopher kings, right? And there's also the great mysticism that develops somewhat through Augustine, right, but also through Pseudo Dionysius, of the Platonic ideal, right? Okay, fine. We
Right.
do need that because that's a ground of our mystical sort of imagination, but the Aristotelian is equally necessary because of the way in which it breaks down the questions, as we've just done with cause, or what you're talking about, qualia, right? If we can actually talk properly about, you know, the kinds of things that Aristotle tries to show in the categories of how do you name things to start with.
Right.
So much would come back into our educational rigor if we could simply, start with the clear terms. And
Exactly.
I've taught a class on the trivium for several years, and it was quite fun. The first time I taught it, and we are trying to talk about commentaries on the categories, and we instantly ended up in the 12th century argument over universals and the difference. It was great, and you realize
Yeah.
this was a generation of a good deal of scholastic theology or philosophy and theology is simply trying to label things correctly.
Right.
Naming,
Right.
it's incredibly difficult, and so I think it's a gift of the tradition that we have both Plato and Aristotle. We don't want to be only Aristotelian, but we don't want to be
Right.
only Platonic either.
Right. Right. Well, and I think, and I do have a video coming out about this. Um, a lot of these people they don't understand philosophy at all. They read Plato, but I don't know what they read. They seem to have, honestly, they just seem to have very low reading comprehension. And then they think Plato's cave is some story about a guy breaking free from the chains. And I'm like, I don't. What did you read? That's not. It, it's worse, right? Like Plato says that can't happen at all. Cannot happen, and you wouldn't want it to happen. And oh, by the way, it's used because it's at the beginning of book 7. It's used as a contrast, right, for the problem of the philosopher king,
Mm.
right, which is you have to take him away from his pursuit of the good, drag him all the way, take him away. Like, no, it's good for you, but we're here for the city, dear Glaucon, as Socrates, the character, says about a zillion times in the Republic. Drag him down to the bottom of the city so that he can fix a bunch of things and be hated for it.
Yeah.
That's the reason. But they more importantly skip the end of book 10, which once you understand the end of book 10, it's all over. Like these people talking about Neoplatonism and all this other junk. I'm like, I don't. Did you not read the end? Did you not? Did you? It ends with the story of a resurrection. That wasn't a hint to you that maybe there's an evolution, if you want to use the vile non-science, from that sort of, we'll call it inevitable somehow, from the development of anything. You can use logic, reason, rationality. What's that going to develop into? It's going to develop into a more perfect form of that story, right? A Christian would just go, duh, right? And then say, of course, Plato was a Christian before Christ because it's in the Republic,
Right.
right? And people just kind of skip over all this. But I think that's part of that is because we've got this tension, maybe before Immanuel Kant, but particularly from Immanuel Kant, who just says dumb things, which I don't know why anybody listens to him. He says kind of dumb things. His starting axioms are clearly just not correct. And he wants to, separate philosophy from being the handmaiden of religion. And I'm like, doesn't even make any sense. But to the ancient Greeks, as near as I can tell, and I'm no Greek scholar by any means, as near as I can tell, their definition of philosophy is this is the bucket into which ontologies go.
Mm.
Right? It's the holding cell for ontologies of various natures. Each of the ontologies is then a type of science or something in sort of more recent terms. I don't like the term modern. I have a whole video on that.
Well, modern, I'd say modern is useful if you understand it as this imaginary that's created itself in the oppositional way that we've described, right?
Right. So as they're separating and separating and separating from the we'll just call it Christian framework. I like the word Christian, but it works here if we go back before the Protestant Reformation anyway. They're fighting against this Christian framework constantly and trying to separate themselves and separate out, and get further and further away from this, horrible tyrannical Christianity idea or set of ideas. And in the process, they're flattening the world, creating this intimacy crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And people, they can't look up. I mean, part of the problem is, I hope you get your conversation with Dr. Peterson. I'd like one. I'd like a shot at that.
I think it's unlikely.
I think
I'm friends with all the wrong people.
Yeah, you're enemies with all the wrong people. That's the problem. But they're conceptually, they don't understand creation. Like they don't actually understand the concept that there was something before them and that came from somewhere. And I can sort of demonstrate this, kind of easily, I think. So there's a conversation that John Vervaeke had with Jonathan Peugeot and Jordan Hall. It was a wonderful conversation. I like all three of those guys. I did a commentary on this. It's 4 parts because, of course, it is. It's very, very hard to see what's going on in that conversation. And at one point, so John's got this Awakening from Meaning Crisis series, which is excellent in some ways, and in some ways makes you want to tear your hair out, which is why I don't have any now. It's because of that.
You watched all the wrong podcasts.
There you go. I watched all the wrong stuff. But he says in there that agape, which is, that's because he doesn't like the word love, and fair enough. Like he does good work when he stops talking about love and says we equivocate on it. So this agapic love is what brings a baby, which he actually describes as a slug in the series, into being. And I was like, well, sure, like I don't like it, but it's close enough. But then in this conversation, he says to these two, which is just mind-blowing to me, he says, why do you want God to love you? Like, why is that part necessary? And I'm kind of like, John, using your system, your logic, your reason, your rationality, your outline from your big series that put you on the map, it would have to be that way or humans couldn't be. Like the verb to be, being. Being requires love. According to you, why is this hard? But he couldn't do
he would
it.
say he wants us loving each other. He doesn't want God loving us. Well, okay, so
he can't look up. He can't look up and see the quality relationship emanating down from the creator to the slug to make it a being. I mean, which is weird because, like I said, it's his outline. I don't know why you can't see it.
Right. So it is interesting. So now I think I understand better what you're wrestling with. When you've said this several times, they can't look up, that they're looking at this completely flat world, and they
can't look down either, so they don't see.
Yeah, so they have no heaven or hell, so they have no.
But they don't have a real concept of evil,
or they have no transcendence, and therefore they can't have any sense of not being in God's grace, right? So they can't have a sense of the horror.
They don't have a conception of grace. Like they're way off. They're not even close to that. They can't even do the math. If you as a parent brings your child into being through love, why wouldn't God bring humans into being through love? Like I'm genuinely just freaking confused, but that's the flattening. That's the inability to look up. And then you also can't look down, which means all evil has to be something flat, like, I don't know, let's go with Hitler, right? Or let's get right. And then you have to transfer it by saying X equals Y. So Trump equals Hitler, or, guy I don't like equals Hitler, or whoever equals racist because I don't like it. And therefore it must be evil. And so it's a very flat conception of evil too,
Mm-hmm.
not just right. And so they may use the word emanation, but they have no idea what it means. And if you listen really carefully, I mean, Peterson does this too, but Vervaeke does it a lot. They'll say, well, this comes from that, and then emerges from the bottom. I'll use emerges like 17,000 times, and then they'll say emanation once, and they'll say, well, of course there's emanation, and then they'll go right back to let me tell you about emergence every single time. It's like clockwork with these people.
You've clearly listened to them more than I have. I
I'm
gave up
kind
on
of an expert in Vervaeke's work.
some of
So,
those
yeah.
conversations a while ago, and I haven't,
Oh, good for you. Save
do not,
yourself.
don't keep hitting that tar baby. So it's like, well, we can't. I mean, thinking about it's like, how would you persuade them? What kind of what should we talk? We talk about what the positive version of a, the argument would be. I mean, so the intimacy crisis. You said let's you asked me on to talk about that because I'm a girl and I can
Right.
give you my
Right.
perspective on that. I agree. I think we've made a case for the men. Men's desire for the meaning in all of this.
Yep.
Um, Women.
Right. Well, and
And
I
what's
think
interesting is there's no. Doesn't Andrew Wilson's wife do a podcast?
she does. She
Rachel
does.
Wilson. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been trying to get her too, but we're going back
Um,
and forth. And
but it's more on these conversations are more men. It's very like old school scholasticism where these guys are all at the universities, although these are not universities, but they're all in debates,
right.
right? And they enjoy doing debates, and the women are sitting there going, "Oh my god." Which is my usual take on, it's like scholasticism, blah. Although I
Right.
have become a little more patient with the scholastics because I've spent the last year reading a lot about Franciscans, and adore Bonaventure. So I have to give them some space of having set up some of these problems that men like arguing about, but women no, because if you look
Right.
at what the medieval women of the same period whose writings we have are doing, they're writing love stories about God.
Oh.
Yes, yes. I mean, this is okay. So, to give a picture of what our friends on the internet are missing when they refuse to allow for the transcendence, what medieval Christians would have learned, and we can show this quite clearly in things like the early preaching, the early letters that the popes write to the Anglo-Saxons when Gregory the Great is trying to convert Ethelbert of Kent and so forth. They start with creation, and a good deal of our, I mean, some of the best like Old English poetry is creation stories, and the sort of glory of, we're in Advent now, right? And it's like the Tolkien got his image of the star, the Arundel the mariner, right, from one of
Mm-hmm.
these Old English Advent
Yeah.
lyrics where you're praising
Right.
the light coming into the world. So the glory of medieval Christianity is constantly thinking on the beauty of creation.
Mm.
It's so funny when you think about, oh, the gloomy Middle Ages. We're also hopefully celebrating, the reopening of Notre Dame in Paris this week. And, those cathedrals are, everyone knows they're, built on this mysticism of light that at least the school of Chartres in the 12th century is very interested in, which comes out of their Platonic, Neoplatonic desire
Right.
to ascend up through the ranks of the angels to the Godhead and so forth. But all of that, it's like medieval Christianity is so intensely joyous and focused on the light that comes into the world
Mm.
that ironically, in the high Middle Ages, they end up having the great meditations, which is what people now tend to think about, oh, Catholicism, all gloomy and everything, is because that meditation on Christ on the cross, or Christ suffering in the passion, or the stations of the cross, or the sorrows of Mary standing beside the cross in the Stabat Mater or something like that. This is the amazement at God, the creator of everything, like it's like,
Right.
and you really just have to sit there and hold it. Again, I love Tolkien's description of this because he has it in one of the later works where he's the elf and the woman are talking about, it's like, what hope do the men have? And she said, well, there is this story that the author of everything, it's like, you think about this as the artist, right? The artist of everything could enter into his own work, like
Right.
the artist into the teller into the singer into a song, the teller into his tale. The artist, the maker of everything, God in majesty. And most early medieval representations of Christ are in majesty, enthroned on the rainbow, surrounded by the angels and the four animals of the chariot, right? The evangelical animals and so forth. It's like that majesty. It's like, really just hold it in your mind. Entered into the world through Mary. And you did
Right.
ask me in setting me up to come here to talk
Yeah.
something about Mary, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, so she is the portal, right? We like
Mm.
images of portal. She's the portal for the entry of the creator into his work,
Own work. Yeah.
his own work. And everybody gets all hung up on, oh, was she virgin, and was she immaculate? And it's like, really, you're not really grasping the starting
Yeah.
point here, which is the creator of everything entered into his own work, right? And
Right.
when you're
Right.
saying that they're not getting the transcendence and the sense that the reality of heaven, I think it's an interesting problem because it's there in our Father, right? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's like, what's this heaven thing? Right?
Right.
What kind of space or entity or reality is it? It's like, well, it's where God is, right? It's our Father who art in heaven. And somehow, and the temple is the imagery of that, right? That's the
Right.
temple is this portal. And we love portal imagery. Like the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is all about doorways, right? You go through
Yep.
the portal from Narnia into our world and back, and so forth. That
Very popular video game called Portal. And that's what you
except
shoot a gun to create a portal and it goes somewhere else. So
yeah,
yeah,
but at
it's
the end of that,
everywhere.
the computer is gloating how it's still winning. All right, still alive.
Yes, that's the postmodern, yeah, fooling everybody
Yeah, I
and
fooled you.
everyone
You
not
didn't get there.
noticing.
Okay, but yes, that portal, the portal imagery, right? I like when we're doing videos like this. It's like I'm looking through my camera, so it's kind of
Yep.
this light portal to be in contact with you guys on the internet. Okay, get that in your head, and then through Mary, right?
Mhm.
So in the medieval conception of her, she's the temple, and I was just peer reviewer for a lovely article that is nothing but I was published as the peer reviewer, so I can say this too.
Oh,
And I've tweeted this. It's on my Twitter right now and in my Telegram and things like that. This amazing paper that's mainly hymns in which Mary is described as the temple over and over and over and over. Mary is the temple. She
mm,
is, if you think of temple as portal, so veil and the portal through which the creator enters into his creation.
right.
Now, that is all simple. And I would say this is what it meant to be Christian in the Middle Ages. You would know this because it's in every hymn, it's in every liturgy, it's in every
Mm.
sermon. Creator, right?
Yep. Yep.
Then, okay, one, the Christmas meditation is this, right? Somehow God enters into his creation. The Passion and Easter meditation, and particularly the Passion, the Good Friday meditation, and he dies and suffers
Right.
for love of us, right?
Right.
So all of
Right.
their meditations, and this is, I'm going to pull this back around in my Trumpian weave. Joe Rogan said that Trump does weaves, and now I realize I do too. Them, it's like great, we're all weaving. That the what the high the 12th, 13th, 14th century women mystics are most like fixed on is this meditation of he loved us so much, he entered into our reality, our created material, physical, suffering existence, shared it, and died on the cross. Right. So
Mhm.
those cross meditations, they're all about, his love and the passion. They're incredibly intimate. Talk about intimacy, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
that is the recognition of the intimacy of God with us. And then our souls are supposed to be, our body and soul, and talk about the intimacy that we should have in sexuality, that same kind of recognition. It's like when you have sex and you conceive a child, it's a, it's a microcosm of what I've just been
Right.
describing.
Right, and then I will link that back to Girard, even though I think his observation is extremely banal, but apparently we need it,
Not
right? Like,
everybody can be a medievalist. I mean, actually, you all could just read a lot, right? It's like
read a
it's
lot,
all
read a
out
lot,
there.
read a
It's
lot.
all out there.
But this idea that and it's Peterson gets really close to this all the time and then falls short for reasons I don't quite understand. But the idea is that you need an exemplification that's above and outside. Two things, not just meta, which means outside. It's got to be above you, and that makes you better at doing that thing, right? Because you have an example to look at, and that's the mimicry, and you mimic what God the Father did, right, for you in creation, and that's how you raise your child, and that the meditation on the intimacy between, we'll say, God and the world is the same thing, right? You want to mimic that relationship in your relationship with your spouse, right? So all of this mimicry is going on, and it's super important, and that links back to, John Vervaeke uses the term participatory knowledge. Not particularly a fan of participatory knowledge as such, but that idea is really important. And the reason why it's important is because I think in the age of gnosis, telling somebody that knowledge is not the highest value, it's never going to fly. It's one of the mistakes Christians make all the time. It's never going to fly. They're not there yet, right? It's too fast, too far. And so
okay, so now I have a hook for you. I mentioned how
okay.
much I love Bonaventure. Well, the reason I'm dealing with Bonaventure is I've been working for my specialty in my scholarship is devotion to Mary. I've read a lot of Marian texts, and I've read a lot of Marian texts that nobody else has in some centuries. And particularly for the 13th century, one of the things that a number of her devotees do is write incredibly long catalogs of all her names. Now you say, Mary, she's got one name. How many names could she have? Well, one of my favorite texts is by Serva Sanctus of Faenza, who was a Franciscan, lived in Florence, probably taught Dante. So this actually matters. And what he writes is a catalog of 150 names for Mary in Scripture. Now, this caught my attention because I'm very interested in the way in which the medieval descriptions of her. She's temple, but she's also mountain and city and river and temple furniture and trees and ecclesiasticus, right? It's like they're seeing her through all of these in the scriptures. They're wisdom characters, right? Lady wisdom speaks as, I was a cedar, exalted like a cedar and a palm tree and, rose, that wisdom in the Old Testament has this tree-like quality. So they take those characteristics of Mary, but she's also, the tree, Well, Serva Sanctus and his contemporaries also say, well, if she is the one through whom the creator came into his creation, she holds all of creation. and then they start realizing that as temple, she in fact shows forth the mystery of all the different creatures as well. Serva Sanctus's list is 150 creatures, which he finds in Scripture. The first of which, and this is very important for the Franciscans, is light. The Franciscans, like everybody's fascinated with light. They're very fascinated with optics in the 12th and 13th centuries. They do a lot of like actual experiments on optics, like for glasses. You wouldn't, no scientist without the spectacles. They do things like experiments on rainbows and so forth. But they're doing it, and this gets to your also that language of exemplar. Exemplar means pattern. I ended up reading about Bonaventure because Serva Sanctus keeps saying Mary is the pattern for all of these things, right? She is actually, she's like the blueprint of creation because she's the temple. Moses has shown the pattern on the mountain of the tabernacle. She is the tabernacle. It's like you get through Mary, and this is a wonderful meditation for those of you who are thinking about Notre Dame in Paris this week. It's like the way in which Mary is shown there, particularly in the windows, in the glass, right? It's like they're trying to show the way in which the light shines through her, shines through that glass into our ability to perceive the incarnation, right? Exemplar. Now that is not a neutral term for Bonaventure. It's this talking about
Right.
knowledge, right? It's trying to understand, again, back to this creation, right? God creates, they're to a certain extent Neoplatonic because they're worrying about these ideas, right? It's kind of a Neoplatonic thing, but it seems to me it's somewhat different. It's saying somehow, because it's also Aristotelian, we need to study all the creatures in all of their properties. And this is what Serva Sanctus does in his description of Mary as the creatures. You study the trees that she is because each one of their properties show you something about the mystery of Mary, who is full of grace because she is the one through whom the creator entered into his creation.
Right.
Exemplarity is this desire to see the design that we are made
Mhm.
within. If Peterson is using it with that sort of like, well, there's this model that he's not even thinking about what model it is. It's the model shown to
Right.
Moses on the mountain of
Right.
creation, right? We
Right.
have the
Right.
story of Genesis that we do. I know Peterson just published a book on Genesis. I have it. I have not read it yet. We have the story of Genesis that we do because it was shown to Moses on the mountain. That's
Mhm.
the tradition. It
Mhm.
was shown to Moses on the mountain, along with things like the pattern for the tabernacle, which itself was meant to replicate creation.
Right.
None of these things are separable from the mystery of we are made.
Right.
Not zero makes sense unless in the beginning God created heaven and earth. That's it. In the beginning, was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Right. So,
All of that is the core of our reality, which is
mm,
we are creatures.
right. Right. So I wanna tie that in to, if you think of the Protestant Reformation, which to me, I just call it the Protestant catastrophe, because as near as I can tell, it was just a catastrophe. There's nothing else going on there. Um, in terms of the loss of a bunch of things, right? The Protestants, they don't have a bunch of things. The first thing and the biggest thing I've said all along, knowing nothing about this, and no, Anselm, I'm still not a theologian, don't qualify, never gonna, um, is Mary. And you just
Oh
kind of
yeah.
outlined it brilliantly, right? Like, boy, you kind of lose actually everything at that point. Like, it's all over. Like, the game over, dude. But you also lose tradition, and you lose a stable liturgy over time, right? They just redefine tradition as to whatever we've been doing my whole life. It's like, that's not tradition, right? Um,
No, it's what's the truth that's handed down. It's the handed down, the thing that's
Right,
handed down.
it's the
Yeah,
multi-generational, but there's the flattening again.
right.
They flatten history down to the lifespan of a person, and it's like, yeah, but all the important things you need to know are actually have to be handed down, because they're all about things you haven't done yet. Like, you've only been 30 once, and you only do that once. And before you've done that, you haven't done it. And a bunch of things usually change, right? Right. You only have right, you only have your first kid once, right? And then a bunch of things change. And then you have to know, like, if you have a second kid, like, well, that's not the same as the first. You can't know these things for yourself. It's impossible, right? Because it hasn't happened to you yet, right? Which is why this idea of participatory knowledge is really important, right? But that has to be handed down. Like, you probably want to follow a formula, something like this, because your great 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 grandfather handed all this down, right? Experience down to you, right? And it got enhanced, maybe unenhanced at the same time, because turns out we're not perfect, and we don't live in a perfect world. I don't know if you knew that. I didn't want to shock you too much. But like, we don't have a sense for that, right? We have a sense for, we live in a video game reality where things are actually perfect, and we can speed run the video game and get all the points, and there's crazy manipulations. But in terms of education, what happens is, I've said this before, um, it's not that they took religion out of education. They certainly did that. But they took out, maybe not entirely, right? But they removed recess, gym, art, and music. Now, all of these things have very interesting things in common, right? Because what you're left with is propositional knowledge. That's what you're
Mm.
left with. You don't have anything else. And if you think of cognition in terms of, well, we need two types of learning, and I think it's Dale Farron Farad Farron, maybe educational scholar, basically points this out. Like, if you do too much propositional too early, your outcomes are bad for your children. Like, if
Mm,
you send them to pre-K and they sit at a desk, they're screwed for the rest of their lives. They're completely screwed, and it's in the data. It's been there for decades at this point. Just nobody notices this or something. For someone, I do. I don't know why everybody else missed it. Um, so if you think of cognition as that way, like, oh, you don't want too many propositions too soon. You don't want that way of learning, because there's other ways of learning, better ways, exemplification, right? And what we do in our model, we sort of rejiggered John Vervaeke's model of 4 P's of knowledge. He's describing information. The type of information that corresponds to, we call poetic. So the poetic way of understanding the world is understanding basically how you're connected in the world, right? And that would involve things like, how am I connected to the creation of the world, right? And how is the creation of the world connected to me? Because, if you think of Mary as a gateway for these things, it goes both ways. Like, you
right.
can't see God clearly without that temple, that portal, right? And he can't see you clearly either if you keep rejecting it. If you keep
Well, there's that. So I think that you going off into education is another thing. That I mentioned this conference that I did with my brother on the different
I
cultures,
just want
right?
to let me interrupt you real quick.
Sure.
I just want to make it clear, because everyone in the United States seems to be really stupid on this issue. There's two types of education in the US. There's
Right.
lower education, which is really important and everybody ignores, and that's where we fall short as a nation. And there's higher education, which is where actually the US is better than everybody else, and there isn't a number two. So I just want to make that really clear, because we tend to squish those again. We flatten them and say, oh, education in the US sucks. No, it doesn't. Lower education in the US sucks. Higher education in the US is awesome. But anyway, sorry, continue.
The purpose of education is what is the problem, right? And this conference
Mm,
that my brother and I he did was on the two cultures, and it meant to be from C.P. Snow's essay on the two cultures of arts and sciences, basically
mm,
like STEM versus humanities. We set it up as well. It's also we used to talk about the seven liberal arts of the trivium and the quadrivium. So the language arts of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, which we've talked about this afternoon, right? Because the scholastics are very good at logic and dialectic, and but they're also as preachers having to use rhetoric, and grammar is the basic naming things, right? So there's those
right,
language problems, and then
right,
the quadrivium as the mathematical arts of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These two together, and this is one the classical education schools that are interested in recovering the old model of education, and say, well, we have both language and math, we have both the language arts and the mathematical arts, and we'll twin them together like Dorothy Sayers has said, to recover what they imagine was the ancient more integrated educational system. But as you rightly said, that this isn't terrifically meaningful without actually music and art. Because in fact, what those two things get, what you get when you put those two things together is the liturgy. You get
right,
the language arts, which you need for prayer and verbalization of writing poetry. So you have hymns and things like that, and you need the mathematical arts for music and to set the calendar. Right. So the reason that
right,
the monastic tradition was so focused on the seven liberal arts was basically for prayer, for the liturgy. What you're describing now in our failure of modern education, there's a vast irony here. One, Stephen Protero's book on religious literacy is quite eye-opening. If you want to know why we have no religion in American education, it's not that it was kicked out. It was that the Protestant universities, speaking of higher education, agreed not to fight about it anymore and leave it to the Sunday
mm,
schools. So you could say it's a failure of our churches not carrying on with proper religious education, but the secularization of American Protestant education was because the Protestant denominations agreed to stop trying to figure out which one was right. So it's another of those. Catholic
right.
education, whatever's happened to it, is a different issue, and that I'm less directly familiar with. I'm sort of passively familiar with it from colleagues, but I grew up as a Protestant, so I have this understanding.
Mm.
And Protestant education, has there's layers in that too between the Anglican and the Presbyterian and such, but that it's that's a sort of default problem of the Reformation of where does religious education fit, and you can separate it out and say the inner man is different from the outer man, and so you can have a secular outer political world that is not your inner man, so forth. The medieval understanding understands the tensions, but doesn't make them separable in those terms.
Right.
Um,
Right.
that's and then to say what we have now, and I think everyone's now horribly aware of this now. Our public education system was obviously designed in the early 20th century to create, and everybody always says this, and I was like, why weren't we listening, to create citizens? But
Right.
it was not designed to create, philosophers. They never said that. They
Right.
wanted to
Right.
create workers for factories, full, flat out, right?
Right.
And then going on what I said, the promise of, oh, you'll get out of, get out of the working class and into the middle class. All it ever promised in those terms was, yeah, you can become white collar rather than blue collar.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, insofar as our education system, you saying I'm not sure whether I appreciate or not your praising of our higher education. Yes, we have some, we're good at certain kinds of research work. Fair enough. I do, University of Chicago is one of the better places to do that level. But our frustration, I think, why all these guys are on the internet trying to look for meaning is because we gave up on that. Right? There is no philosophy is a a tiny field that is struggling within itself to define
Right.
why it should exist. Religious
Oh,
studies, is another tiny field, again, struggling to define whether or not it should exist. And
right.
to think about this is like to say the arts of, thinking why are in utter collapse.
Yeah. That's well said. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and it's ironic too, because we have this big battle now about some living in South Carolina at the moment,
Mm.
and they're going through all kinds of problems because Civil War, long story, they unfunded education to get rid of the Northerners. And if you know Northerners the way I do, that's the right answer. Whatever you can do to get rid of them, it's a
My
good.
my dad as a Southerner had a phrase for them.
Yeah, I bet. I bet. Um, yeah, many phrases. It's not easy living in South Carolina when they know you're from New England. But anyway,
Yankee is the polite half of it.
that's the polite one. Yeah, yeah. Carpetbaggers. Yeah. But that that
We should embrace
whole
our regional differences. I'm just saying, right? It's like
true, true.
these are hidden, hidden tensions that we need to figure out why we have.
Well, yeah, we need to expose them for the qualities
Yeah,
that they possess, right? Because without
right.
without the acceptance, and that's really what it is. So down here, you've got a bunch of, well, now they're funding education again. Like all of a sudden, in the past like 30 or 40 years or something, I don't know
Mm.
exactly. I know I can tell you I've got two brand new schools a mile from my house in two different directions, like, and they're gorgeous schools. They're middle schools and
Mm.
grammar schools, I think, but um the factories that are moving in, the car companies that are moving in, like Volvo, are upset because they don't have trained workers, right? And they've got all kinds of wild education programs here. For some of them are free. I'm like, what? You guys are sending people to these schools for free? What's going on? All kinds of experimental education for for service workers, right? But the
Mm.
tensions around education are all with the Peterson and Vervaeke guys who are studying, to your point, these very small, sort of fields that are very precise and they're very researchy, right? And we've had a complete loss of quote liberal arts, such as it was. I'm sure when my father was a PhD in English lit. He's a Blake scholar. Um,
English used to be one of the larger fields, and
right, right.
yeah, it's created a problem
But
for itself recently, but
but that back, the way they taught it back then was a whole different thing. And part of that, I benefited from that because I didn't grow up with this, and I never went to college, thankfully, because I saw this coming when I was young. I never got infected with a bad read of Plato's Republic, for example, which is kind of a big deal, right? I never got infected with this recapitulation and this postmodern, you can reframe things better than the author can because you've written at least as many books as that author, right? And they were at least as well received. Nonsense, this lit crit garbage. It's one reason I'm not a fan of Gerard. I don't find lit crit to be a valid field at all. At least
say
not the way
Gerard.
it's
No, so Gerard actually is better than the field. He's independent of a lot of that. But okay, there was another thing that I remember. The other half of it was, why do Protestants care about education in the first place? And this is, this sort of irony of it is literacy. I say the medieval literacy was all. I mean, literacy was functional for the liturgy. It's
right,
literacy,
right,
being able to write. The main thing that we have from the Middle Ages are commentaries on scripture and liturgical books. And
right,
you need a point to want to write. Well, when you get the
right.
printing press, obviously you want to make sure all your children can read because you need them reading the scriptures. So literacy has always been tied to prayer. And therefore I think if we're the United States is in a crisis now, saying worried kids don't read, and it's like, well, you haven't given them any point
Any
in
point to read?
reading,
Yeah.
right? It's like, just like, you'll be morally better if you read. Well, maybe,
What does
right?
it? What does it
Maybe.
serve?
What does it serve?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. It's like saying, in the service industries or in the factories and such like that, education for skills actually matters a great deal. And in the Middle Ages, the good jobs that the we have contracts for, because you so want your son to be able to do this, you'll contract him out to be an apprentice to somebody. We're like skills, right?
Right,
Actual skills.
right.
Talking about the leveling of thing, the worst thing that's happened in education in modernity is this promise that absolutely everybody is going to be a white collar clerk. I mean,
Exactly,
that's
exactly.
insane to
Well, and
say
that
that
they should want
literally
to be that.
the only job that we have are office jobs.
Yeah, this idea of a pure service economy and
It's
weird.
pure clerkship economy. It's not even service, right? It's like, if you did service well, I find it, if we're doing service economy, it's like we all talking about Sam and Frodo when we were at the
Yeah,
beginning, right? Back in the prior to World War I, there were servants. And if you
right.
read stuff like either Sam and Frodo or Dorothy Sayers' novels on Lord Peter Wimsey and his valet
Mm,
Bunter and stuff, right? There were personal servants. We just share our servants now in the
right,
service
right.
industries. Everybody has their waiter and their hairdresser and their
We've squished it. We've squished it down, and it's especially bad
right,
in Europe. Europe is
right,
a
right.
almost fully service economy,
They're all
and it's a
yeah, it's
mess.
all servants, right? You see nothing but servants with no dignity
Yep.
in their service. So that's an interesting sort of phenomena. But I think the problem we have in education, our higher education, still maybe it functions still because we do actually have a goal of new knowledge or something like that. I'm not sure, but if the kids in school now are frustrated, it's not because they don't want to learn. It's because there's no like point to what they're
Right,
learning. There's no actual answer that they're trying to get from, oh, you need to be able to pass this test. It's
right.
very it's just soul destroying.
Well, then they default to an economic explanation, right? So
Right,
they've got the
right,
flat
right,
world of economics, and they go, "Oh, well, the point of this is to earn money, and then I can
right,
have my happiness or whatever nonsense."
right, right,
And and that's like none of this is an actual problem until you destroy the family. And when you destroy the family, everything changes because the
right,
family can fix all this, right? Like if the got a good, strong family unit, and the father says, "No, you're going to church," or the mother says that, right? Or no, you're going to learn this even though you don't want to, right? Or no, you're going to do this. You're not going to become a crazy artist because most people can't be artists. Sorry. Jonathan Michaud did a wonderful job at the Symbolic World Conference last year talking about this, or earlier this year, I guess. Um, you can't like train yourself to be an artist. And I do have a video, the training versus education, right? So skills are training. They're not
Right,
education.
you could well, and okay, so these are we've mixed up in a lot of different layers with the
Sure.
intimacy thing. I think, okay, so when you're talking about the family, there are a lot of mythologies about the family. It is true that there seem to be, as one scholar put it, the Northern European marriage pattern, something like that. It's like so
Mm,
things that we need to know about our deep history that we tend to not appreciate. Um, a good deal of our culture, and we'll talk about you Yankees, right? A good deal of our culture, Marx was not wrong. It's bourgeois, right? It comes
right.
out of the
That's correct.
towns, medieval towns, urban development of towns. The Franciscans and the Dominicans in the 13th century were, they begged, you know, practically, sort of, in towns, right? They're a town phenomenon. They preach to the towns. The town population is very interested in literacy. The Florentines sent all their kids to school in the 13th century. It's like the towns created a lot of these structures. I got focused on that now. Where was I go? Oh yes, and so our sense of what a family is comes out of that environment, right? That um, I say economic and social and cultural environment. Obviously, with marriage, right? That we have the sense that we do that both men and women make the couple, right? That's
Yep.
one. It has Roman roots and sort of legal categories of consent, but the expectation that both the husband and wife have to say "I do" in the ceremony is a 12th century development in canon law, right? That the lawyers are very, very clear that Mary and Joseph's marriage was a real marriage, even though they didn't have sex, because there was consent at the
Oh,
to be a marriage, right?
okay.
There's a big debate in the 12th century whether or not it takes the consent or the consummation, whether it's the sex act or the
Mm,
consent, and they have to
mm,
include non-consummated, because otherwise Mary and Joseph aren't truly married. So they make that, of course, creates the reality for women in the West that you are not meant to be married to somebody against your will by your family, which is
mm.
what politically it was a problem, that the noble families particularly used their daughters in marriage alliances and things like that. And the clergy stepped in and said, no, she has to say I do just as the man does. That
Wow.
is obviously so these, the town life, the expectation of marriage as this kind of, mutually consensual relationship. And then it does seem to be the case that the families tended to be the father, mother, children, but there would be servants, right? There are always servants. There's no such thing as a household without other members, right? So our image of the nuclear family with just the parents and kids, it requires things like washing machines.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Modern appliances, so it fits from the 40s and 50s, which is probably why, those were that was hard for the women in the suburbs in some respects, because you don't have the rest of the household there, right? All of the different layers of responsibilities and work that it took to create a full house prior to all of the mechanization. Um, I tend to get frustrated when people think that it's a bad thing that we have multi-generational households. I'm like, yeah, that's just families, right? Families used to have multi-generations. Like your family might have a house. The claim that we all should go off and buy our own houses as soon as we get married, I think that's also a feature of the 20th century's
Oh, yeah.
imagining. So insofar as we're trying to imagine like what kind of family we should have now, w- thinking of it solely in terms of the father and mother and the kids is a bit limited. And you were already saying that it's like, you need to have the wisdom of the previous generation for guidance, and
You need it. Yeah.
all of that. It's like we need not just families, we need the complete reintegration of all of the networks that we used to have.
Right.
And of course,
Right.
people always found that kind of network frustrating and stifling, thus Romeo and Juliet, which is a tragedy. It's also true that throughout the Middle Ages, the towns grew because younger people went to them, which means they left their families behind in the countryside and went off to be apprentices and servants. And things like that. There's no like golden age where it was all great. That's the obverse of the modernizing fantasy, right? Modernity
Right.
creates certain kinds of possibilities, but it also pretends that some of these things existed in the past when they didn't in those terms.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's very much a hindsight bias, anachronistic
Right.
view of the world based in a scientific or scientistic, to be more precise, way of thinking about things. And I think this is more about the thing that's causing the flattening, right? Which is this: we'll do the science thing, and then I think really what you're seeing now is um, Pastor Paul Van Clay calls it the end of modernity. I think it's a horrible frame. I would call it the end of the age of gnosis, right? Because the problem is this knowledge, this propositions, this highest value formula that they're operating under very clearly. Once you see it, I don't think you can unsee it. Um, and they're running up against, like, education doesn't explain things, science isn't giving answers. There was a wonderful podcast.
Mm.
There's a channel called The Meaning Code, run by Karen Wong, who's wonderful. I've been on it a couple times. But she had Wolfgang Smith and John Vervaeke on, and they both said exactly the same story, which is a very common story. I've heard it many times before, because I used to hang out at Harvard and MIT, and I lived in Boston. I could hang out at these places.
I finally forget your accent isn't Canadian, it's Boston.
Oh yeah, it's thoroughly Boston. Boston and Lowell. Yeah. So when you hang out with these people, you hear always the same story. They reach a certain point in their science where they kind of learned what they wanted to learn, right? And maybe they picked up some other stuff,
Right.
and they didn't get the answer they were looking for. And then they go after it in philosophy, not realizing, as I said earlier, philosophy is just sciences. Like, that's all it is. It's not some mystical thing where, Plato and Aristotle had this what we would call quasi-religious or spiritual conception. That's not what it was. It's not what it is. It's not what it will ever have been. It's really just logic, reason, rationality, and ontology. That's it. That's the whole thing.
Well,
There's no more magic there.
There isn't now, because so much of English philosophy is very analytical and empirical. I mean, it's the field of philosophy. But Aristotle said, I mean, the highest sort of goal for a human being is contemplation. I mean, we have
Right.
in fact
Right.
lost a sense of the value both of prayer and meditation.
Right.
Which is interesting, because there's the sort of new age version of things where everybody does yoga and meditation and things
By
like that,
themselves,
and of course,
on their own.
and that is I mean, if we went that direction, we've gone so many different directions. Then you end up in the dangerous possibility of having demons in touch with you instead of you're focusing on God. So that's a certain kind of problem. But I mean, philosophy, if you're familiar with Pierre Hadot's study of ancient philosophy in the antiquity, which is where, like, the Neoplatonics and the Epicureans and the Stoics and everybody, it was meant to be a way of life, right? It's actually guidance for living the higher and
Right.
contemplation is part of it. That modern
But
philosophy now doesn't seem to have that characteristic, is an impoverishment of the possibilities.
right, but they leave out, what they would call small details, right? So, like, if you actually read the Republic and you pay attention, every time they use logic, reason, and rationality to justify something, and it doesn't work, because guess
Mm.
what? It doesn't work. These are not justifications in and of themselves. They're frameworks for implementing things that are justified. They always appeal to the gods. The Republic is
Okay. Yes. All right. I see.
full
Okay. Yes.
full of references to pagan gods. Like, they're scattered throughout. And if you pay close enough attention, and maybe you can't, although Texas Wisdom Community YouTube channel, we did a whole book club on the Republic. It was wonderful. Danny did it. I just attended and got very angry, as I knew I would, which is why I knew I never should have read the Republic. I just knew it. I knew I would be angry for the rest of my life. Glad I did it late in life.
You put a warning on the Republic. Don't read at your own risk.
Read at your own risk, because once you find out all the bits they're leaving out, you're going to be
Yeah.
awfully pissed off that no one told you this stuff, because it's really important. But the logic, reason, rationality reaches its end. Socrates, maybe it's the character of Socrates, and the real Socrates was that much smarter than Plato said. Seems unlikely. Constantly runs into these walls, and he goes, "Yeah, but Zeus." And then continues his argument.
Oh yes, no. So my brother, whom I mentioned a number of times, he's actually he's a Plato scholar, right? He works with this in the original, and he's made the same argument that philosophers they read all this they read the beginning bits and don't realize that the core of the message is always in what Plato calls the mythos.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
And therefore it is. I think the cave story. I've heard it, but previous discussion I had with Mark Stallman on McLuhan stuff said what Plato was actually revealing there was the Eleusinian mysteries and the showing of the grain at the moment when they're all about to take the drug, basically, because it's a psychotropic, and that's all an illusion. And so what Socrates is doing is threatening their real religion. But I think you're right that Plato, he knows things like, poets are dangerous, musicians are dangerous because they threaten to take over of the mythos that the philosophers themselves are trying to
And so the logic, reason, rationality, or rationality as such, if you want to frame it that way, all that gives you is an implementation. It doesn't give you the motivation. There's no why. Right. And the implementation isn't clear unless you make the assumptions that, well, Zeus said so, or, well, because Hera this, or, whatever nonsense they throw in from the pantheon of gods. That then you have a way to implement. Without that, you actually don't have an implementation. And that's why what science, and separating continually from the tyranny of Christianity, from whose bosom it was born, ungrateful child, is just positing this thing that I like to refer to as OMR, objective material reality, which, hint, doesn't exist. And bigger hint, Einstein pointed out that even if objective material reality existed, it's useless to you, because that's what the theory of relativity actually says. And it took me forever to figure this out, only because, and this is really annoying, it's going to sound horrible, but I got to tell the truth. I had a book on it. I read it like 6 times because I'm like, I don't understand this. No. It was obvious. Like the fact that you see the world differently because you're in a different place, and the same event happens and somebody else is in a different place, and so you actually experience the world differently, was just so duh to me that when I read relativity, I was like, well, of course. I don't. And so I thought I was missing something the whole time. It's like, no, it's just a really basic idea that pretty much anybody who's not totally narcissistic could kind of come to just by talking to other people and saying, oh, for you, the lightning struck at this time, and for me, the lightning struck at that time because I was on the train and you were on the platform. This isn't that hard, right? You don't need to engage with the math. The thought experiments are sufficient to go, oh yeah, that's pretty cool.
I have friends who you can talk to go into detail about why Einstein may not be who we've imagined him to be. But anyway,
he destroyed science. He actually destroyed modern science completely.
Yes, we agree. So I'm thinking there's the problem. All of these arguments is they're not going to persuade anybody who isn't already.
Right.
I mean, in faith, right? And faith is that kind of step and that leap. And I've been thinking about this. It's like, what have we mainly lost to modernity? Well, with the intimacy crisis, what we mainly lost is life.
Yeah.
And so I thought what I was prepping for, because what I thought we were going to talk about was sex. Thinking about, the changes that have taken place with human sexuality and modernity, including 1, contraception, 2, abortion, 3, the sort of expectation that it seems like we've placed, the orgasm bluntly. And it's like this is what everybody's, aiming for, and that's it, right? Which now gives us the pornography crisis, which means that
Right.
in fact we have nobody having any pleasure anymore in sexuality, because it's all been pornography is clearly using it as an addiction.
Right.
I've come around to the, yes, those people that saying, masturbation will make you go blind or whatever, but it's an addiction to your own um in your body, right? It's like I need a hit now. I need some
It,
porn.
it,
I
it does
need
make you go
to get
blind,
well,
technically.
yes,
Yeah,
right. So all of
absolutely.
that, and of course it comes straight up from the first thing that I believe the Pope says. It's like if you're separating sexuality from conception, all of these things follow, right? This
Yep.
sort of this loss of
Yep.
not just the mystery, the loss of the danger of sex leads to a danger or possibility sex leads to another human life, right? A child is straight up. I'm so Catholic now. And I actually am a convert, right? So there's
Mm,
that. I can do Presbyterian to Catholic in another conversation. The Catholic version of things is right, because it's about the wonder of life. It's about
yep.
saying, it's like
Yep.
sexuality is as powerful as it is because one, it's incredibly dangerous for women to allow a man to have sex with you, which is why we have from the Middle Ages absolute conviction that rape is horrific and that women should
Mm,
not be raped because
hmm. Hmm.
consent in marriage, it's you don't do that. But that it, to my favorite phrase of all of this is from Clueless, where the girls are teasing Cher about still being a virgin, and she's like, I'm you see how picky I am about my shoes, and they just go on my feet." Right? You should you should be as picky about, acceding to intimacy with a man as even more picky than you are about picking your shoes, for goodness sake, right? And but the obverse is like, men are clearly hardwired to pursue us women because
Right.
we're about our default should be saying no. Sorry, guys.
Right.
Right. And
Right.
that I would say my age matters in this because I was young in the 70s, and we were being bombarded throughout the 70s with, oh, everybody should be doing it. I was watching The Breakfast Club recently, and the dangerous kid character is teasing the girls about whether or not they're all, teaching everybody there about, you're a virgin, they're supposed to be like 15,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
not
Love the one
married.
you're with.
Like,
Love
how
the
did
one you're with.
how did we get to this point where it's like it's
Right.
wrong not to wait before you're married? It's blah 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 blah. Okay, so for the conversation that I was supposed to be having last Friday on religion, among other things, I was reading The Hammer of Witches, which is the great printed late 15th century, description of the problem of witchcraft in Germany, which
Mm,
is sort of this the pre-Protestant version of things. Oh, the Catholic Church is also evil, and they hunted witches. Like, actually, the church was pretty like agnostic, not agnostic. The Spanish, in fact, found very few witches because they were Catholic and they knew how to do an inquisition. The Protestants found witches everywhere because they clearly
everywhere.
didn't know. They didn't know how. But
Right.
what I noticed, the thing that the guys writing, the Dominicans writing the Hammer Witches were worried about was, guess what? Contraception and abortion. The things
Mm,
that the witches did most clearly, and they also made men think that they didn't have their member anymore, right? They create illusions for the guys to think they're castrated, which I is like, this is interesting. It's like it's literally the things that we're wrestling with right now.
right. Right.
The witches are able to prevent conception, so they make whole regions sterile. There's also lots of details of, like, can they make a particular woman sterile with a particular man, right? It's so interesting. It's like it's straight up exactly what we are wrestling with now. The sort of loss of fertility, loss of
Yeah.
intimacy, loss of life, and the separation of the sexual act from the recognition that conception is this moment of a soul's entering into our incarnate life. um if to be arguing in the way in which the scientists are about, oh, transhumanism and oh, robotics and oh, this and all that. And it's like, do you really understand how precious life is? And I think people don't. I
No,
think
they don't.
that what we've lost is the horror at the things that in the 15th century were attributed to sorcery.
Right. Right. Well, and that's the intimacy crisis, because they don't
Yes.
understand the quality of the relationship of a being. This is
Right.
why they're confused about, well, are dogs conscious? Or maybe
They're more conscious than yes. And you know how I really came to this. Okay, so I only do like dogs that I buy from breeders because support family dog racing. And I have a corgi who I wanted him not to have his tail docked, right? So to get a dog, one of these breeds that are typically docked, you have to choose them at birth, right? Because the breeders
right.
otherwise will follow breed specifications and dock them. Well, so I got in touch with the breeder, and the first litter, I mean, like all things that I was in the line for, right? Putting name down. It's like these are precious animals. All of the puppies died except for one who they said, okay, here's your puppy. She died a few days later. And
Oh,
I was suddenly like, why can't we see this with human beings? To say, you know,
right.
a baby that lives, a baby that's conceived and born is this incredibly precious gift. And to end up in a situation where we have to worry about arguing against abortion is insane.
Right.
We
Right.
are with the intimacy crisis is the insanity of whatever's been going on since the 60s and 70s. It starts, I'm absolutely convinced now, it starts with contraception, not abortion is, you know, it should have been the backstop in case the contraception fails. It's like, are you kidding me? Why are you
Right.
contracepting in the first place? And I will say that, as I did not grow up Catholic, so I reckon, you know, putting the frisson back in sexuality of this is how we make more people
Right. Right.
is why nobody, I mean, it's like I think people are depressed and sad, and women are, you know, obsessing over their cats because we're
Yeah.
supposed to be in life. We are supposed to be having
Right.
children. We are supposed to be families and generations and life. And
Right.
if the thing that we've lost most of that makes me just weep now is this connection with sex and conception, sex
Right.
and like literally the
Right.
gift of life. And I got hit harder when all the puppies died.
Right.
And then I got
Right.
another, you know, they had another litter and the puppies lived and I got to pick my dog, right? But it's like,
Oh, that's good.
don't take it for granted. We take life so for granted.
For
And
granted. Right. Well, they did that. Nobody points at it. Right. They don't
right.
point it.
It's a
Right. And then they,
problem.
and
It's
then they,
overpopulation. Life is
they
this disease, this cancer on the world. And it's like we are made in not
right.
just we are made in the image and likeness of God. God loved us so much. Talk about love. God loved us so much. He wants more of us. That's the one command he gave. Be fruitful and multiply.
Right. And without, because a lot of people don't know what children are. Children are potential. Right.
Their
They're
children are precious.
but
It's like the most precious thing in the world. I can't not. I mean, I'm like so ready to be a grandmother, right? It's like I can't see babies and like have more.
but when you don't have that
That's the
connection,
most beautiful thing in the world I've ever seen. It's a baby.
it's a baby. Yeah. Yeah. But you need to be able to connect to that future, to that potential. And so part of the meaning crisis is just, well, sure,
Life.
maybe you can find meaning for yourself in your own life for a while, but then when you realize you're going to die, which hopefully happens before you actually die, the meaning, whatever meaning you gave yourself to get yourself to whatever age you're at when that hits, that's gone. Like that
Oh
meaning
yeah.
has vanished because you haven't been paying attention to potential, right? Which outlives you, which is roughly speaking, children. And that's where the problem comes in. And you know, it's worse, right? Because at some point, even John Vervaeke, who has kids, doesn't seem to understand the quality relationship, because again, they're asking dumb questions like, well, where's consciousness in a dog versus consciousness in a person? It's like, you don't understand quality of relationship. Like as such, like why would you
Right.
even ask these completely dumb questions? These are stupid questions. You just
Well,
steal
I
from
think
that.
because science is obsessed, as we said, with the material, the machine-like, and it's imagining babies as machines, like that you could put together
Right.
and make a
Right.
machine, and that and the AI stuff is only going to make people nuttier about this. The claim that somehow we're going to be godlike. It's like, so you're going to, I mean, the asking AI questions. If you're doing anything other than expecting a dictionary definition based on previous dictionary definitions, you're crazy, because you are, um, I mean, using them as oracles. Everything, all of paganism is so one. Witchcraft is clearly about preventing fertility,
Right.
and therefore preventing children, and everything that follows from that. And paganism, we did a episode on Mosaic Ark with um, John Daniel Davidson, who did the Pagan America book, and he's talking about that paganism is human sacrifice and these bargains, right? It's like you're going to bargain with here, you're going to make this sacrifice, you're going to bargain for fame and power and
Right.
so forth. And all of the machines, I mean, there's straight up idolatry, because you're going to ask the machine, you're going to ask the AI for the meaning of life. Are you
Right.
nuts?
Right.
Right? It's-
They are nuts. They are nuts.
yes, but
They can't.
in ways that we actually, if you can see them as the it's not just parallels, it's the same phenomenon, just with
Right.
different descriptors on it. Now it's what the Bible warns about with idolatry. It's what the Bible warns about
Yes.
with paganism. It's what the Bible warns about with consulting with witches and sorcerers and such, is about death.
Right. Right. And that's part of the squishing of the world. Like, you can't get
Yeah.
around quality of relationship. So instead of having it with something above and outside yourself, like the creator, however you don't even need to go to God. Like, that's the other mistake that Christians make. They go to God immediately, and there's all sorts of misconceptions wrapped up. It's like, well, something had to have, it doesn't even need to be a person, right? Something had to have created everything that you were born into and therefore connected to. When that connection isn't there, when that level of quality relationship isn't there, it moves down the stack, because it doesn't go away. Like, you need quality connection.
Hmm.
Equality doctrine is wrong, right? Nobody can live that way, because then you couldn't see. You wouldn't know the difference between you and me and you and other people, and they get very confusing very fast. So they just put it in the lesser things, right? They move it kind of down the stack. That's why the materialism for me is a flattening, and it's John
Oh,
McRae
okay.
said,
Yeah. See, it's like,
yeah,
well,
it
Tolkien would say there's no, but it's like but there's no point in asking what's the purpose of life unless there's some person that you could ask it of, right? And
exactly,
he's very
exactly.
clear that it's like it's the creator. Is personal.
It has to be personal.
There, it's and our purpose is to praise God. our,
Right,
our
right.
purpose is liturgical, in that, back when I said, like education, its point is so that you have the skills, the art, the music, the
The
architecture,
literature. Yeah.
to praise, right? And all art comes from that desire to celebrate, to say thank you to God, and for the magnificence of his gifts to us. And that's why our
Right.
modern art is so hideous and ugly, and it's a banana that some guy eats off the wall, right? It's a refusal to
Doesn't
try
connect.
to capture that mystery of heaven.
It doesn't connect up.
Yeah.
It connects
Yes.
across.
No, your image of the flattening is very, very
Oh, good, good.
do you know Flatland? You know the allegory Flatland from
Yes, I pointed it all the time. That's
yes,
how I
yes.
got it.
No, I love being the sphere. But it does mean, it's like you drop through and you're trying to explain stuff to people. I feel this a lot, right? It's, well, I've seen this thing and I'm trying to explain it to you, and they're just like going, "What?" Right?
What? Yeah, yeah.
The sort of invitation to wonder and transcendence. We just have to keep making the invitation.
Right, right. And you can see the science sort of bumping up against, we can't do that, trying to upgrade to philosophy, which isn't an upgrade, but they think it is,
Right.
right? And so now they're, oh, I reached the end of science, and now I'm trying philosophy. And then they find out that philosophy is completely bankrupt and doesn't believe in truth. And then, right, and now we've got all
As
kinds
a
of
modern academic discipline, it's bankrupt, is what you mean.
right,
Yeah.
right. So
Yeah.
my buddy Dr. Lantern Jack, he's an ancient philologist because he refuses to be called a modern philosopher. He actually went to a bunch of these universities and talked to the heads of the departments and said, well, don't you believe in truth? And they're like, no, we don't. And he's like,
Okay. Yeah.
everybody outside the university thinks that that's what you're searching for, right? And they're like, yeah, maybe, we don't care. And I was like, well,
Right.
that's
Yeah.
interesting. And he said that was common. That was more common than the other case. And so they're kind of hanging their hat on something that the people in it aren't even trying to do, right? Because they realize that they're up against the ends of science. Like, science isn't able to do the work that we thought we wanted to do, and we can't acquiesce for whatever reason. And we think this is like loss of access to the poetic way of informing the world, to this idea of creation. And it puts me in the uncomfortable position of saying, Ken Ham, who is crazy, he's crazy, just a nutty person, him and his silly museum, is correct, though, because he says you can't drag people, say, off the road straight to the cross. You need to drag them back to Genesis. It's like, well, yes, actually, that's correct. You need to get them to buy into the starting point, the start of the story. And Jonathan Pageau used to say, where are you standing? He stopped doing that. But it's not just where are you standing, but where are you starting? What's your starting axiom? What are your starting suppositions? Where are you grounding in your start to make the arguments that you're making? Right? Because that's the way, basically, if you want to defeat any of these people, I've been doing it for decades, that's how you do it. You get them to their starting point. They never have one. Their argument falls apart, and then you win without a PhD, which makes you feel very good. It doesn't really help anybody, but still, I like to feel good and win. So,
well, you keep saying poetic, and I will say so that what I've realized in my own work is, poetry was absolutely necessary, and so we're writing right now. The Dragon Common Room is writing. We're finishing Act 3 of a 5-act poem on this problem. It's like the showing the meaning of the incarnation, with called Draco Alchemicus, because you do it through dragons. But it's also this. There's certain things that it's like with mathematics, you can say certain things in mathematics you can't actually say verbally. Same with music. There's certain things that you can say in poetry that, because of, and particularly that we're using, meter and rhyme and things like that. There's certain things that you can say poetically that you cannot, in fact, say in prose.
That's right.
I think the liturgy is, the liturgy is the wedding of all of these arts, the poetry, the music, the architecture, and it's that moment of when all of these things harmonize, that the understanding is there. I do think, contemplation and philosophy in the medieval Bonaventure, and everybody should read Bonaventure, at least read, the Journey of the Mind to God, or that one's actually a good one to start with. That you realize that it's this consonance and integration that is what our souls are yearning for. And it
Right.
you don't, and what you've been saying about it, all being just propositional and such, that can be a handmaiden to this desire for consonance, but it's the harmony and like literally the heavenly harmonies that our souls are yearning for.
Right. So we have a model that I mentioned this before, that we adapted from Vervaeke's 4 P's of knowledge. Right. It's actually 4 P's of information, because that's literally what he's describing when he's talking about these things. He has this thing called perspectival knowledge. That's actually incorrect, so we fixed it. So I have 2 videos. I got one live stream and one very early video with the slide. Actually, I need to update it because it's a little wrong. We have a newer slide available on the markofwisdom.org website, by the way. But that idea that there's a poetic way of informing the world, and the implications of not being able to do that anymore because maybe it's atrophied or maybe you never had it. Both are at least theoretically possible. That's a big deal, because what we found, and we used to when John did his meditation series in particular, that's when I built the community around his work, really,
Mhm.
on this Discord server. And what we found was people, before they were engaging with the meditation series and things like that in groups, because we were very group oriented and participation oriented, they did not like
Right.
poetry. And they had either never engaged with it in a way that they liked it ever, or they lost their love of poetry. And then we were able to get
Right.
them back into poetry through various practices and means, because we had a motivated audience. So I don't know how easy this is, and to some extent, I'll indict the entire YouTube project, right? Like, you can't do it online. Right. Now we had Discord, which is a special tool. Basically, it's got voice and video, but we had motivated people who were disciplined enough to come every week and engage in practices. And because John talked about practices back then, they wanted more and more in different practices, and we were developing practices based on some of John's stuff to get people engaged. Little did we know at the time, we didn't have the words for it. Thankfully, John gives us a science of meaning. We can talk about it now. To engage people in the act of manifesting meaning in the world. And that, it starts out very, very small. It's a very disappointing thing. But that kind of reliably got them to church. It just took a very long time. And you didn't point at church at all. We never mentioned church ever. That was like, don't even bother. I mean, it would
Right.
take care of itself mysteriously. I don't know. It just happens.
Yes, that's what I'm doing. That's
Right.
why I started the Dragon Common Room with our poetry writing, and it's the regular practice. It's monastic.
Mm,
It's literally the regular prayer practice is what people need. And the talk
right.
going back to Luther, I mean, the biggest sort of swindle he has in his teaching is when he's talking about, he says, has a thing in his table talk where he says that babbling and bellowing that used to go on in churches wasn't real prayer. We do real prayer. And I'm like, well, you just, he spent
Wow.
years in that babbling and bellowing that wasn't real prayer, and then just magically was able to, like, improvise. It's
Right.
it's like someone who's been deeply trained in scales and then claiming they don't need, you know, the well-tempered clavier for training in music. Yes, you did,
Yeah.
but, it feels inspired and improvisational once you have all of that grounding from the regular
That's right.
practice.
That's right.
And that is
Right.
it's like so what do the Protestants do? You've said it. They destroy the monasteries, and with the monasteries, they destroy that regular practice. I mean, literally regular practice. They destroy
Right.
all of the regular life of literacy, of art, of singing,
Yep.
of the prayer practice. And it's that's what one, that's what I said, he's a medievalist, but I also recognize it's possible to have that now in the same way if you set up the kinds of regular practice you're describing you did with your group.
Mm.
And I'm
Right.
delighted to hear how well it worked. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Not surprised, but happy, right? Because it fascinatingly does.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, you lose other things with the monasteries. More importantly, you lose basically medicine. You lose welfare. You lose
Oh,
the
yeah, yeah,
orphanage.
all of those, but they all came out of the fact that these were places for
Right.
prayer, right?
Right.
And and
Right.
and and
Well,
therefore structured. If you go into apologizing that they were good land managers, which they were, you've lost the problem, which is what we've been talking about today. It's like they looked up, right? That
right.
their whole existence, which universities ought to be, but we can't be because we're not. I mean, our divinity school is one of the if my colleagues are mad at me, the divinity school is most mad at me because I claimed that, like, universities were originally founded as places where we argued theology, and they said, "No, we're not." And I'm like, "What?"
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Philosophy and
Right.
religious studies are both, crippled right now because they can't admit the focus that they ought to have.
Well, and
Yeah.
and and they're beginning, but I would argue that two more important things were lost, right? Because of this structure of liturgy and all these other components that the monasteries have. Two things happen. One is there's is there is a level of quality of relationships that builds space for effectively that can
Oh
hold
yeah, they
all of these
also
other things.
they're good at training to living in community. They have
Right,
a lot of
right,
men and women that have a lot of experience dealing with human frailty.
right. But dealing
And
with human
how
frailty requires
frustrating
all the
people
practice.
are.
Right. And the
Yeah,
practice builds the intimacy, and the intimacy holds everything together. Right.
right,
Like a
right.
community has a level of intimacy, and without it, it may look like a community, but it'll blow up soon enough. But then more importantly, the monasteries are the anchor of the church. So it's the
Yes,
churches,
yes,
which is the gateway for the people to kind of interact, right? But the monasteries are actually the exemplar for the for the churches, right? For the priests, that's who they look up to. They don't look
yes.
straight up, and we've lost all of that, and that's part of the loss of intimacy. It comes straight from the loss from the monasteries.
We agree.
All
So
right, I think
I promised you 2 hours.
I know, I know. I think we should do this again, ma'am. What do you
I
think?
I was very enjoyable. I'm happy to be in conversation.
Great.
I'm worried that you spend too much of your time worrying about what other people think, and I like what you think.
Oh, thanks. Well, I'm trying to, as I said in the email, I'm trying to explore my idea and see how plausible it is, especially given a historical context that I don't have. I mean, I'm a huge lover of history, but I'm very broad and I'm not very deep at all on, and it's particularly on that area because I just sort of took it for granted. Well, of course, these guys are awesome. They had it right. I don't feudalism
Okay,
forever. Like, what are
for
you guys
yes.
talking about, right? Like, I don't.
So it's obviously more complicated than it was all good in the Middle Ages, but for
Yeah,
anybody who wants reading, so my website is dragoncommonroom.com, and under the Mosaic Arc, which is the videos, there's a page that's study guides, more reading than you could possibly want, I'm sure. I've put together a lot of different reading lists for different levels of engagement, and I have some specifically on Christianity, but there are also links to things like my academic homepage with more reading on the history of the Middle Ages. It's
great.
you can read. Yeah, there's a lot there. This is what's funny about, we know more about the Middle Ages now than we ever have, and
Right.
yet it's one of those. But you have to do the reading. It's
Right.
like scholars. You just have to do the reading, and so it's hard to get out for people to know really how much we know.
Right.
It's a
Right.
curious problem.
Right. No,
Yeah.
it's that's good. Yeah, I'll update the description and all that. We'll include all those links in the description on the video. But thank you so much for your time. I'm really glad I get to talk intimacy crisis. I don't like to do it alone because I figure I shouldn't be mentioning it without the female perspective around, lest I get myself into more trouble than I normally do.
Babies are great.
Babies are great. Well, I noticed earlier, I just wanted to note this, that one of my, nice loyal viewers, has already upgraded you to grandma because of his 2-year-old. So,
Oh,
there you go.
I'd be honorary grandma. I'm happy. I'm happy. That's great.
It already happened. So, magic can still happen on the internet, and the intimacy is not lost. So, look, everybody, I'm gonna
That's
end the
wonderful. That's
recording.
wonderful.
And thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Let's do this again at some point in the new year or something.
Certainly.